doubts about their government saw Qasem Soleimani as a loyal soldier. Revenge, revenge, says the placard, a message to the Americans.
Everyone loved him. He was a selfless person who knew he would be martyred one day. His loss is very hard for us to bear.
Tens of thousands turned out in Kerman, Soleimani's hometown. The Iranian government has declared 3 days of mourning for the man whose job it was to counter US power by financing and arming militia groups across the Middle East. On state TV, the announcer delivered a message from the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Harsh retaliation is waiting for the criminals whose filthy hands spilt the blood of Qasem Soleimani. The spokesman for Iran's Revolutionary Guard was torn between grief and fury.
The temporary happiness of Americans and Zionists will not last long and will soon turn to mourning.
The leader of Friday prayers in Tehran was even more blood-curdling.
We will take such revenge on them that their bright days will turn to dark night.
Death to America, responded the crowd. They chant that by rote, but today it has more meaning. In the early hours of this morning, Iraqis saw a fireball near Baghdad airport caused by the drone strike that killed Soleimani and several others, including General Mohandes, the Iraqi who headed the militia Soleimani sponsored. Soleimani has long been in the American sights. He was renowned as a quietly charismatic super spy and military commander, dedicated to extending Iranian power across the region. He, rather than an Iraqi, was in ultimate command of the militia which defeated the Islamic State in Iraq in 2017. Then Iran and the US were unusually on the same side. But he's also blamed for proliferating a special kind of improvised explosive device that killed hundreds of US and British soldiers after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Previous American presidents feared the consequences of killing him. In the last few days, Iranian-sponsored militia attacked the US embassy in Baghdad. No one was killed, but Americans and their allies are vulnerable now. Iran could retaliate across the Middle East. The Quds force that Soleimani headed not only sponsors militia in Iraq, which could attack US and allied troops there, but also arms militia in Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which could target Israel, as well as Houthi rebels in Yemen, which might fire rockets at Saudi Arabia. Israeli forces are on heightened alert today on both the Syrian and Lebanese borders, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came back to Tel Aviv early from a trip to Greece.
President Trump deserves all the credit for acting swiftly, forcefully, decisively. Israel stands with the United States.
But Iraqis fear what's in store. Young people protesting about corruption and Iranian influence know they're just pawns in a chess game with their country as the board. Iraq's most important cleric feels the same.
The unfortunate incidents that Baghdad witnessed during the past days led to the brutal attack near its international airport last night, which represents a blatant violation of Iraqi sovereignty and a violation of international conventions.
This is all that remains of the car that carried Qasem Soleimani. The consequences of his assassination could be felt for years to come.
Lindsay Hilson reporting. Well, amid calls for restraint across the world, in Washington, leading Democrats called it a dangerous escalation, which could leave the US on the brink of another major conflict. Iraq swiftly condemned the killing, while Turkey warned it could hurt peace and stability across the entire region. In a moment, we'll be speaking to our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, in Beirut. But first, here's our Washington correspondent, Siobhan Kennedy. Siobhan.
Well, Matt, in the past half an hour, the US has announced it will send a further 3,500 troops to the Middle East. This on top of increased deployments in the past 24 hours and a build-up of troops there since May. And this all from a president whose stated aim is to pull forces out of the region. Hundreds of US troops arrive in Kuwait yesterday, an immediate response force, the US said, amid heightened concerns about Iranian aggression. Hours later, 3 American rockets target Baghdad airport, killing Iran's most respected military leader, Qasem Soleimani. Before any official confirmation, President Trump tweeted, no words, just this. Then, minutes later, the first 6 words of the Pentagon's official statement, at the direction of the president. It went on to explain the justification. General Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region. General Soleimani and his Quds force were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American and coalition service members and the wounding of thousands more. The statement ends ominously. The strike was aimed at deterring future Iranian attack plans.
The risk of doing nothing was enormous.
The Secretary of State provided no evidence of those future attack plans, instead insisting the decision to assassinate Iran's most revered general might somehow de-escalate the tension.
We don't seek war with Iran, but we at the same time are not going to stand by and watch the Iranians escalate and continue to put American lives at risk without responding in a way that disrupts, defends, deters, and creates an opportunity to de-escalate the situation.
Other administrations had long identified Soleimani as a target but didn't act. P.J. Crowley worked in President Obama's State Department.
This was a legitimate military target, and the president chose to take this action. The question is not whether it's politically motivated. The question is whether there's a strategy behind it.
Do you think it's likely that President Trump has thought this through in his head?
I think it's highly likely that this was a one-time, short-term action. You know, Soleimani is a bad hombre, let's take him out. He doesn't think 3 steps ahead. So I think that here's where we are.
And here's how we got here. President Trump announced the US would pull out of the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, adopting instead a strategy of maximum pressure with crippling sanctions. That summer, Soleimani addressed Trump's threats directly. We are near you where you can't even imagine. Come, we are ready. If you begin the war, we will end the war. You know that this war will destroy all that you possess. Even answering the president's Game of Thrones "sanctions are coming" meme with one of his own, "I will stand against you." In May and June last year, the US blamed Iran for attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf. Iran then downed a US drone, and pulling back from the brink, President Trump called off a retaliatory strike at the 11th hour. And this week, the US embassy in Baghdad came under siege, attacked by supporters of an Iran-backed militia. Ironically, President Trump's stated aim is to withdraw from what he calls endless wars. His taunts in 2011 about President Obama have today come back to haunt him.
Our president will start a war with Iran because he has absolutely no ability to negotiate. He's weak and he's ineffective. So the only way he figures that he's going to get reelected, and as sure as you're sitting there, is to start a war with Iran.
President Obama's vice president and President Trump's 2020 rival says a stick of dynamite has been tossed into a tinderbox.
This is and was an enormous escalation, and it follows a string of dubious actions that President Trump has taken that have drastically increased the prospects and the risk of war with Iran and danger to Americans.
From his Palm Beach resort, Donald Trump is tweeting. Killing Soleimani, he says, is ultimately all about protecting American citizens. It's a decision he's happy to own, but he will also own the consequences of what happens next. Well, Donald Trump's actions have heightened political tensions here too. Remember, he's just been impeached, so tensions were already pretty high. And while everybody agrees that Qasem Soleimani had American blood on his hands and deserved to be taken out of the picture, the Democrats are furious at what they see as the president's seemingly unilateral action, to do this without consulting Congress first or any senior members like the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, all of whom now are extremely concerned that the president's actions could bump America into what they call an unauthorized war with no strategy really for how it all ends. And that's the big question here. Has Donald Trump got a contingency plan for what happens next? We know the US embassy in Iraq has told all US citizens there to leave immediately, and there are reports too of defences being bolstered in cities like New York. But what's the plan beyond that? Or are we witnessing what we've become used to with Donald Trump now in the past? Act first and think later.
Siobhan, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's go now to the Lebanese capital, Beirut, and our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman. Jonathan, what's the reaction there?
Well, I think the talk is not of diplomacy, Matt. The talk is of revenge. Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, the spiritual leader of Hezbollah, the Shia group in southern Beirut, has talked of revenge, echoing statements by Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran itself. We should probably take those with a bit of a pinch of salt. What that actually means, well, a possible Hezbollah attack on the Israeli border, but those attacks have not proved very successful in the past, and you can be sure that the Israelis will respond with force. I think more likely is a response of some kind, definitely, because I think a red line has been crossed in Tehran. Whether that's a cyber attack or an attack on shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. You may remember that British oil tanker, British flagged oil tanker, which was seized briefly last summer. But I think most likely is a response inside Iraq itself, where there are American troops and indeed a few hundred British troops. And you have to remember that there were Iranian proxy militia traveling with Qasem Soleimani from Baghdad airport, and they will be the ones seeking revenge first and foremost. Although the irony is that the person who would probably be most involved in planning for a response to this US attack is, of course, Qasem Soleimani himself, who is now dead.
You mentioned the British troops there, Jonathan. We also know that the British government wasn't told about this airstrike before it took place. What do you think the British response to all this will be?
Well, I think actually the British will be quite relieved that it is out there, that they didn't know about this attack, because they have been trying ever since Donald Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. They have been trying to put clear water between themselves and the Americans on Iranian policy. They don't want to be scooped up in the same bucket as the Americans. They don't want themselves to be seen as a proxy for the Americans in the Middle East, so that a British oil tanker might be seized, so that British troops might be attacked. They don't want that to happen. And I can tell you that before Christmas, British officials in Whitehall were scenario planning what would happen if an American official or a contractor in this case was killed in Iraq by Iranian proxies. And that is precisely what happened a week ago. An American contractor was killed in northern Iraq in a rocket attack. The situation then escalated with that two-day siege on the US embassy in Baghdad. And for the Americans, this is a red line, which has clearly been crossed, just as the death of Qasem Soleimani is a red line for the Iranians. So the British feared this situation was coming. Whether the clear water they've been trying to put between themselves and the Americans is enough to defend their interests is a different question. And the Iranians can strike anywhere across the world. I mean, it is well known, it's been known by intelligence agencies for years, that they have sleeper cells. I can tell you, for example, in the approach to the 2012 Olympics in London, when there was increased tension between Israel and Iran, the fear among British officials was that an Iranian sleeper cell would be activated in London itself. So this response will be of Iran's choosing, and we don't know what form it will take or indeed when it will take place.
Jonathan Rugman in Beirut, thanks very much. Kathy.
Thanks, Matt. Well, earlier I spoke to Brian Hook, who's the US Special Representative for Iran at the State Department. I asked him first whether, if this was indeed a preemptive attack, what exactly was being preempted?
This was a defensive attack designed to prevent the loss of American life. Qasem Soleimani was looking to kill at least hundreds of Americans. And the reason why he was in the region to begin with was to plot these attacks. And so the president took decisive action to protect American lives, and this was long overdue. Qasem Soleimani has been the architect of all of Iran's significant terrorism for the last 20 years. He alone directed the deaths of 608 American soldiers in Iraq during the war.
If it's a defensive attack that saved American lives, in your words, it's also an attack that could cost lives in the very near future.
Well, if we had not taken decisive action yesterday, and if we were dealing with hundreds of American deaths, we would be having this interview and you would be asking me, why didn't you neutralize Qasem Soleimani sooner?
The threat to American lives was that imminent, was it?
Yes, I reviewed all of the intelligence over the last few days. We knew why Qasem Soleimani was in the region. We had very solid intelligence on the attacks that he was planning. And this was a decision that enjoyed the support of the president's national security cabinet. There is no question that the risks of doing nothing outweighed the risks of eliminating Qasem Soleimani.
Why now, though? Because any of Donald Trump's predecessors could have taken this action. They didn't because they suspected that it might lead to more loss of life, more loss of American lives in particular. So isn't this a reckless action that could yield some very devastating consequences?
It would have been reckless not to eliminate him yesterday in light of the attacks that he was planning against American personnel in the region. And hope is not a strategy. You just can't hope that his plans are going to fail. It was imperative that we take decisive action, and we threatened that we would do this.
Are you convinced, though, that this action you took was legal? The UN doesn't appear to be convinced of that. I mean, after all, he is a senior official from an internationally recognized state. That's not the same as a terrorist, is it?
Well, if you mention the United Nations, the UN designated him as a terrorist, and he is under a travel ban. So perhaps the UN should be asking, why was a designated terrorist traveling outside of Iran and moving around the region so freely, plotting terrorist attacks?
The UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killing has said that the strike was unlawful, particularly because of the others killed alongside him.
The UN Special Rapporteur is not an American citizen, has no idea what he's talking about. This was a defensive action. Days ago, after the embassy was attacked, people were asking, they were saying, well, why isn't the president doing more? He then takes out Qasem Soleimani and other terrorists, and now they're asking, well, isn't this hasty? So again, this is a no-win situation. We took the necessary step yesterday.
What have the UK lives potentially put at risk by this action? Was the UK consulted in advance? And if not, why not? Because troops, for example, in the Middle East, UK troops, are potentially at very much more risk today than they were before this attack.
I don't think that's true. The United Kingdom has troops in the Middle East, and they are under risk by Qasem Soleimani, orchestrating proxies to conduct terrorist attacks against bases where UK forces are stationed.
Is this a declaration of war by the US against Iran?
Of course not. It was a defensive action to prevent the loss of American lives and to deter further Iranian aggression.
Wasn't your existing strategy actually paying off? Because the sanctions meant that Iranians were taking to the streets in protest against their own regime in greater numbers than at any point in years. So actually, your strategy was working. Now you've given them a reason to hate the US again.
I don't think that's true. The Iranian people hate this regime. The people of Iraq and Lebanon have been rising up against Iranian domination. And so we do have a strategy that's been in place now for almost 3 years. It has been very successful. But a big component of that strategy is making clear that if we are attacked, that we will respond in self-defense.
Brian Hook, thank you very much for joining me. Well, I also spoke to Mohammad Marandi, who's a professor at the University of Tehran, before we came on air. I asked him for his reaction to the claim that the attack was based on firm intelligence that hundreds of American lives were at risk.
The United States has never been honest when it has carried out atrocities in this part of the region, and we don't expect them to change today. In fact, when the Iraqi Prime Minister told the Americans not to carry out the strikes against the Iraqi soldiers a couple of days ago, the Americans disobeyed and violated Iraqi sovereignty. But also when the Iraqi Prime Minister said, hand over the evidence, the Americans refused. Why? Both out of arrogance, but most importantly, because there is no evidence.
Well, Donald Trump tweeted today that Soleimani had killed and wounded thousands of Americans and was plotting to kill many more.
Why shouldn't the Iraqis resist the American occupation? They've destroyed the country. As we speak, they ignore the prime minister. They ignore their agreement with the Iraqi government. They refuse to provide information or intelligence justifying their attacks.
So how do you think Iran will now respond? What will be the nature of the revenge that is being spoken about?
I don't have that sort of information. But it's not just the Iranians. The Americans have committed an act of war against the Iraqis. They murdered a senior Iraqi military commander. The deputy head of the Popular Mobilization Forces.
But some in Iraq are pleased that Soleimani is gone.
We'll see tomorrow during the funeral in Iraq how many people show up to commemorate General Soleimani and to commemorate the Iraqi commander Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Then you'll see where public opinion lies. The United States, through these atrocities, they've united the Iranians in a way that I haven't seen in a very long time. Everyone has rallied around the flag and the state.
But before this point, the demonstrations against the Iranian regime were bigger than at any point for years.
The demonstrations were against the administration for carrying out a very poorly executed policy for increasing gasoline prices. That has nothing to do with the state.
There was discontent with the Iranian demonstration, and it was at a greater level than I've seen in years, and perhaps you've seen in years.
Yes, and the same is true in your country. But what does that have to do with the murder of a senior Iranian military commander?
And what will be the consequences of this latest attack, do you think?
I think it's a turning point. The American arrogance is what is going to bring down the U.S. role in Iraq. It's not the 19th century anymore. This is not going to work. This is not sustainable.
The US and the UK, other countries around the world are urging a de-escalation of this crisis now. What might Iran do to de-escalate the situation, in your view?
I'm sorry, but the United States cannot carry out an act of war and then get away with it. That's not going to happen. And that's not what countries around the world are saying. That's what US allies are saying. So the Americans get to kill people, and then we have de-escalation. Sorry, that's not going to work.
So too late for Iran to de-escalate herself?
The United States has carried out an act of war. What is there to de-escalate?
Well, they insist they were taking preemptive action based on intelligence to save hundreds of American lives.
Who are the Americans to dictate such facts to the rest of the world? No one believes the American narrative anymore. We live in a region where people see the devastation and destruction that your government and European governments alongside the Americans have brought upon us. The people here feel the devastation on a daily basis. They feel the humiliation.
Where do you think this ends?
I think this will lead to a major defeat of the United States. The United States, its status in the region is on the decline, and it is increasingly relying on weak regimes like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and the Israeli regime. The United States is going to be forced to withdraw from the region, and especially Iraq.
Mohammed Randi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we asked the Foreign Office for an interview, but no one was available from the government. In a statement earlier today, the Foreign Secretary urged all parties to de-escalate, saying further conflict is in none of our interests. But joining me now is Mustafa Salim in Baghdad for the Washington Post, a US former senior policy advisor to the President's Special Representative, Afghanistan and Pakistan, Vali Nasser, from Washington, D.C., and Emma Sky is with me here. She was advisor to the former Commanding General of US forces in Iraq. Welcome to you all. Let me start with you, Emma. What has this unleashed?
Well, that really is the question. I think the assassination of Qasem Soleimani has taken everyone by surprise. There have been numerous times in previous years where Qasem Soleimani was in the crosshairs and previous administrations decided they were not going to assassinate him.
Because it was too risky?
It was seen as an act of war against Iran.
Is that what this is?
Well, President Trump is saying that this is supposed to deter Iran from malign activity. But as you've heard from previous speakers, in Iran, it is really seen as an act of war against them.
Is there a plan here?
You know, over a year ago, President Trump took America out of the Iran nuclear deal and then exerted this maximum pressure. And this maximum pressure was supposed to bring Iran back to the negotiating table or lead to a change in the regime. But Iran has responded to the maximum pressure with its own acts of provocation, whether it's been against shipping in the Gulf, the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, and inside Iraq, where you have seen Kataib Hezbollah, a Shia militia backed by Iran, that has been targeting American forces inside Iraq.
Let me turn to you, Vasil Nasser, in Washington, D.C. I mean, you know, we're all trying to grasp what the consequences of this are. Iran has vowed revenge, as it has done on so many occasions in the past. But is this different this time, and what can we expect?
I think it is different in the sense that this is a watershed moment in U.S.-Iran relations. We're entering a completely new phase. First of all, President Trump's maximum pressure strategy has obviously collapsed because economic pressure did not get what the administration wanted, so it's now gone beyond economic pressure to actual provocations that could lead Iran and the United States into open conflict. And I think for Iranians, this was a very clear attack on the Iranian regime, a kind of action that goes to the heart of the stability of the regime. I think they're motivated not just to revenge, but also to send a kind of signal to the United States that would deter it from pursuing this course going forward. And I think, we're very focused on how Iran may retaliate with some kind of a terrorist act or hitting embassies. I think their top priority will be to force the United States out of Iraq, and to do so using numbers in the streets. Perhaps the funeral of Qasem Soleimani would be a starting point to try to rally a major street demonstrations that could put pressure on the U.S., put pressure on the Iraqi parliament, and ultimately get the United States to leave Iraq. I think Iran would see that as some kind of a victory and may not necessitate any further action. But I think the Iranians were shocked by what happened, and they are trying to calibrate how best to respond in a way that they would save face, deter the U.S., but also would set a course going forward with this administration.
And just briefly, in terms of the stature of the man, I mean, he was such an important figure for defining Iran's role in the region. To what extent is he a national hero in Iran? We've seen these anti-government demonstrations recently. Do people who don't like the government, did they worship him, for instance?
Well, Qasem Soleimani was made into a larger-than-life figure. He became sort of an iconic figure that stood for all of Iran's regional activities. But in reality, there is a military organization under him that is going to continue going forward. There's going to be another commander. Had he died of natural causes, there would have been a succession in place. But you're correct. Within Iran, there is a very complex picture. The Iranians don't like the security services. They've been angry at the Islamic Republic. They don't like the Revolutionary Guards. But Qasem Soleimani personally enjoyed popularity that was above and beyond any other politician or statesman in Iran, to the point that there was talk of him running for president in Iran. And that had to do with this image that he wasn't corrupt, he was a humble soldier. That's the image he cultivated, that he was pious, that he was defending Shia shrines and holy sites in Iraq and Syria, and that he stood for Iranian national interest. Every Iranian, as much as they detest hard-handedness of the Islamic Republic, deep down has an imperial ambitions. This is in the blood of the Iranians, and Soleimani sort of appealed to that.
Okay, let's turn to Kamel Wazny, who's just joined us, the foreign policy analyst close to Hezbollah, who's also in Beirut. Kamel Wazny, I mean, we're all expecting some sort of response. The Iranian government has vowed revenge in response. Can we expect that response from Hezbollah, and what might it look like?
Well, obviously, now everybody is in the game. The threat and the confrontation is going to go throughout the Middle East. Right now, we've seen the deterrence that was put previously has lost its space, and I think the attack that came by the United States against a major figure, that means it doesn't stop there. It has to go maybe to anybody in the region. So ultimately, I think the confrontation is going to be in the wider scope in the Middle East. So we don't really know where the retaliation gonna come from, but obviously the Trump administration put American at an awkward position. Yes, they were able to nail a major figure, but now they have to evacuate their people from Iraq, and probably they have to evacuate more Americans from throughout the Middle East. So you got one person, but you probably Americans start to losing the ground, their opportunity, their businesses in the Middle East, and ultimately, I think the decision to attack, we don't know when and where and who's gonna carry it, but this is a whole coalition working together to restore probably the deterrence that has been lost in this operation.
Let me ask you briefly, is there an expectation in Beirut tonight of a wider conflict? Is that what people are reckoning on?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Is there an expectation of a wider conflict tonight in Beirut?
Well, everybody is on alert throughout the region. I'm not really, we're not at this point pointing to any place where there can be an imminent confrontation, but I think any confrontation is going to involve the whole region. But we like to see more maybe reasoning in carrying whatever gonna come next, because in the end, I think this region probably deserves peace and stability, and probably need a new vision and outlook from the American perspective, because in the end, a war is not going to yield any victory to anyone in this region, but destruction for everybody. But everybody is on alert, and probably there will be a statement on Sunday from Hezbollah will define the next scope of confrontation.
And we'll be listening out for that. So, Mustafa Salim, let me turn to you in Baghdad. I mean, there are 5,000 troops in Iraq, American troops. There are, I mean, I think as many as 1,000 British troops there, and more apparently on their way. I mean, it is possible, is it not, that these troops will actually disappear, which is, of course, something that General Soleimani wanted all his life.
Yeah, so at the beginning, when this happened last night, according to sources, Soleimani came in order to run the file of picking a new prime minister that should be sized at the measure of the Iranian government to fulfill their needs in Iraq. It all came backfire. Like all the Iranian officials and all the Shia militias here in Iraq, they seeked only to kick out the U.S. troops from Iraq. That's why they went inside the embassy, they stormed the embassy in order to get a pledge to kick out the U.S. forces from Iraq. But then it turned out backfire. Now the number has been increased. They have sent more troops into Iraq and also more troops into the region.
Okay. Let me turn to you, Wali Nasser, quickly in Washington. Do you think that, I mean, look, I know that the Franz Ferdinand reference to the First World War has been circulating on social media all day. Let's be serious here. I mean, how dangerous is this for a wider conflict? You know, even drawing in perhaps the Russians. Very briefly.
Well, the danger is definitely there. The danger of unintended escalation is very much there. I don't think Iranians are looking for war, but they have to respond both to deter the U.S. and also to save face.
Right. And Emma, finally to you. I mean, how worried should we be in terms of a wider conflict? Very brief answer.
I think it's Iraq that is going to be the focus initially of the response. It could well lead to pressure to remove US forces from Iraq. It could well lead perhaps to the closure of the US embassy in Baghdad.
Okay, run out of time. Thanks to all of you. Haven't got time to thank you by name. Thank you very much indeed.